Crime South Africa is an independent podcast and relies on listener support to keep going. There are many ways you can support the podcast. You can check out all of them at truecrimesouthafrica.com. The most impactful way is by joining True Crime South Africa exclusives on Patreon or Paybrew or Apple subscriptions or YouTube memberships. Among other benefits, you'll get free access to online TCSA events, exclusive episodes, discounts on my audiobooks, and ad-free episodes. So you don't have to listen to me say this every week. Listen through to the end of the episode where I discuss more ways you can help support the podcast. Welcome to True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to what is sort of a rewind episode, but also something else. Let me explain. Back in 2021, I covered a case I called The Mystery of Meadowbrook Doe. I think it was one of the most fascinating and mysterious, but also tragic cases I've ever covered on the podcast. And you know by now that the rewind episodes I've been doing are designed to bring attention to the now significant back catalogue of this podcast. I spend many hours on each episode, and there are now more than 200 full case episodes on the podcast. And it just makes sense to highlight these back episodes. So this is that. I wanted to bring Meadowdale Doe's case back to get more ears on her episode. But there's also another element to this episode. What you're going to hear is not actually the original episode. It's actually a chapter from the audiobook version of my book, Bare Bones. Some of you may know that at the end of last year, I published a book, my fourth, which is heavily inspired by the podcast. The book is a collection of 10 of the unsolved cases I've covered on the podcast and includes any updates or new developments that have sometimes come from the coverage on the podcast. I included Meadowdale Doe's case in the book, and as I do with all my books, I recorded an audiobook version. So that is what you'll be hearing in this episode. The chapter from that audiobook covering this case, which is also a rewind back to the original episode. A 2-for-1, if you will. If you'd like to get the whole audiobook, it is available to purchase on all audiobook apps. I'll put some links down in the show notes, and if you struggle to find it, you're welcome to post a comment on any of the socials or apps, and I'll help you out. So, let's get into your rewind of episode 57 and audiobook chapter 4, The Mystery of Meadowbrook Doe. Chapter 4, Meadowbrook Doe. The deep vibration of the jackhammer suddenly ceases. The construction foreman is called over by the operator, his brow creasing in confusion at what he's uncovered. Towing pieces of broken swimming pool lining away, the foreman tries to get a better look. Kneeling, he briefly touches the green material. His eyes adjust, and he snatches his hand away as though the bones in the ground might come to life at any moment. He knows well enough that his job is now officially on hold. A body isn't buried underneath a swimming pool by accident. Someone's darkest secret has just been uncovered. When I covered the Meadowbrook Doe case on the podcast, it was my first Doe. If you consume any American true crime content, you'll regularly hear about unidentified bodies. In South Africa, they don't get much coverage at all. I guess this has to do with how limited our use of DNA identification has been in the past, and to some extent, how limited it remains. Jane and John Does in the US are regularly identified decades after their remains are found, through the efforts of private organizations partnering with law enforcement, primarily using genetic genealogy. The terms Jane and John Doe have been used to describe unidentified people since at least the early 1900s. They were first used in the British legal system, when landlords wanted to take illegal occupants of their land to court. They didn't always know their names, so Jane and John Doe started appearing in legal proceedings. The practice was abolished fairly quickly, but the term stuck as a way to describe people whose names are not known. In the true crime world, Jane and John Does are usually unidentified deceased people. To avoid confusion, a descriptor is usually added relating to the place the body was found or an article of clothing that sets them apart from other does. It took me a little while to come to terms with the concept of covering the murder of a victim whose identity I didn't know. But this case made me think of every missing persons case I covered differently. Those missing people could very well be a Jane or John Doe somewhere. So, while I usually prefer to cover someone's story from as early as possible in their life, to the point when they become the victim of violent crime or an unexplained disappearance, in this case, I had to do the opposite. I had to start at the end point, with the acknowledgement of the victim's eventual fate, and try to work my way backwards. I did so in the hope that if I worked hard enough and had some luck, at some future time, we might be able to tell the beginning of this victim's story and give her back her name. On the 28th of March 2012, Rudy Marks was renovating his home in Meadowbrook, Germiston. He'd bought the house 2 years earlier, and part of his plan was to remove the pool that had been installed more than 20 years before. The water had been pumped out, and the concrete had almost entirely been broken away. Everything was going swimmingly, if you'll excuse the bad pun, until the team of workers reached the steps. The man who made the first sighting acknowledged later that he'd seen something strange as they broke away the concrete, but thought it was his imagination, so he kept working. Then he saw it again. I'm certain that, as most people would, the team assumed that they were looking at the remains of an animal when they peered down into the dark soil. The bones were scattered, and not obviously human. But there was clothing too, and the jawbone looked suspiciously large for a pet. For this episode, I spoke with journalist Charmaine Slater from Caxton Community Newspapers, who covered the Meadowbrook discovery and found the case haunting her for years. When she arrived at the house after receiving a tip-off from a resident in the street, the police were already there. Marks, the homeowner, had been alerted to the discovery by the workmen, and he immediately told them to down tools and contacted the police. Initially, officers from Bedford View took control of the scene. Meadowbrook, though technically in Germiston, is between the R24 and N12 and borders the Germiston and Bedford View precincts. The Marks' street is closer to the N12, which is probably why Bedford View officers attended. But they quickly realised that this was a case meriting more senior attention, and the provincial team was alerted. When police began assessing the scene, they confirmed the initial fears of Marks and his workers. Although laboratory testing would be required for confirmation, it seemed likely that they had found human remains under the swimming pool steps. The remains were completely skeletonized and consisted of a jawbone, what appeared to be leg bones, and a piece of pelvis bone. Detectives also unearthed a green woolen dress, a pair of black tights, and a simple brass ring. Charmaine Slater was on the scene before the provincial unit arrived, and her good professional relationship with the local police meant she got some excellent photographs. Some of the pictures were published by Charmaine's paper, and as I looked at the dress while posting them on social media, something immediately stood out and sent chills down my spine. The material had been slashed in the chest area. My first thought was that the cuts looked like stab marks. Charmaine saw them too and shared my initial impression. She asked one of the police officers, and they said forensic technicians would confirm, but cautioned that the slits or tears could also be due to natural decay of the material. It's understandable that these officers would not have wanted to confirm or deny anything to the media at that point. It was far too early to speculate. But even to my untrained eye, the damage to the dress appears far too uniform and consistent to be from natural decay. The cuts also don't appear anywhere else on the dress, and it feels like too much of a coincidence that they would be in an area an assailant would target if they were intent on causing maximum harm to the person wearing it. It wasn't possible to examine bones from that area of the body for marks caused by a blade, but a lack of marks would not remove the possibility that the victim was stabbed. It could just mean the sharp force injuries did not reach bone level. Looking at the size of the incisions on the material, though, I would think that an instrument of that width would also be long enough to reach the bones. Police determined that the pool had been built in 1989, and it was agreed by all involved that this was probably when Meadowbrook Doe's body was placed there. Detectives traced the owner of the house at the time to the UK, but in a telephone interview, they were unable to provide any information about who Meadowbrook Doe could be. I have the name of the owner at that time, but I will not be sharing it to protect their privacy and the integrity of any future investigations. Rudy Marks was so shaken by the discovery of the remains on his property that he engaged the services of a private forensic scientist and a private investigator. Dr. David Klatzow is a renowned figure in South African forensic science. His first book, Steeped in Blood, puts forward alternative forensic views of several high-profile cases, including the murders of Inga Lotz and Brett Kebbel. Private investigator Henny Els is no stranger to the spotlight either. He worked on the case of Tertius Bosch, the South African cricketer who allegedly died of Guillain-Barré syndrome, but who many believe to have been poisoned. I reached out to Klatzow and Els for comment, but did not receive any response. I will discuss some of Klatzow's findings that were published in the media later in this chapter. The discovery of Meadowbrook Doe was not just a major story for local journalists like Charmaine. It was also closely followed by the national media. As different theories were bandied about, it was understood that the bones would have to be analysed by a forensic anthropologist, and everyone wondered whether a DNA profile would be possible after so many years. At the time, Charmaine contacted Alan Morris, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Human Biology at the University of Cape Town. He told Charmaine that while it should be possible to obtain a DNA profile from the remains, he wasn't sure whether the SAPS had the capability to do so in their laboratories at the time. At this stage of my research, and despite many follow-up inquiries from Charmaine, the case seemed to have ground to a halt. With no DNA, no identity for the victim, and no way of finding out who the individual may have been, it seemed the Meadowbrook Doe mystery was a non-starter. That was not the case, though. Not by a long shot. When police investigated the original installation of the swimming pool, they discovered it had been built by Georgie Pools. The company is now defunct, but investigators spoke with one of its former directors. He said it would be almost impossible to determine which staff members had worked on the pool. This is completely understandable. There is no reason anyone would keep work records from a single site for 23 years at that point. The other former director could not be traced at the time of the initial investigation. Most of my own inquiries pointed to this individual being deceased. One interesting thing did come out of this portion of the investigation, though, when a link was made to one of Georgie Poole's subcontractors, who often worked on installations. This man's name is well known in South Africa for all the wrong reasons. It sends a chill down many spines, and when it is linked with skeletal remains, it becomes all the more eyebrow-raising. In 1989, Georgie Poole subcontracted work to Gert van Rooyen. Between 1988 and 1990, when Van Rooyen wasn't doing construction work, he and his girlfriend, Joey Harthoff, were believed to be kidnapping and possibly murdering young girls. At least 6 girls are believed to have been kidnapped by the couple before Van Rooyen shot Harthoff, then himself, in 1990, while being chased by police. Both died on the scene in Pretoria. The 6 girls who disappeared have never been found, and in the ensuing years, this mystery has only grown. Many theories have been touted, and it is the most requested case for my podcast. It's also the only case in which my research inquiries have been met with threats to my life. But that's a story for another day. With this level of criminal infamy in mind, the discovery of a Van Rooyen connection had everyone's detective minds working overtime. Charmaine Slater did her own investigation. She confirmed that Van Rooyen had indeed installed pools on the East Rand in 1989. Many of his installations were in the Edenvale and Bedford View areas. The seasoned journalist was still sceptical, though. She had seen the remains and the dress, and she didn't believe they belonged to a child. Despite Charmaine's tenacity in this case, constantly following up, never letting an anniversary of Meadowbrook Doe's discovery go unnoticed, she received no feedback from the SAPS. It seemed the case was well and truly cold. When I began investigating, I confirmed some developments with a source close to the case. I completely trust this source, but I also take full responsibility for these 2 pieces of information. I was able to confirm that the forensic anthropologist determined the remains of Meadowbrook Doe belonged to a black female. In 2013, reporters were told that the bones would probably be sent overseas for an attempt to extract a DNA profile, and that was the last anyone heard about that. I can tell you, however, that the extraction was successful, and the SAPS has a full DNA profile for Meadowbrook Doe. Sadly, when it was run through the DNA database of known missing persons, no match was found. This is not surprising. We did not have the same systems in 1989 that we have today, and the old systems did not translate well decades later. So even if Meadowbrook Doe was reported missing by her family, there's a good chance that there is no longer a traceable record of the report. The docket, if it ever existed, may still be around, but it will be coated in dust in an SAPS archive room in whichever town her family lived. The stark truth is that in 1989, even if the disappearance of a black female was reported, it may not have received the attention it deserved. That was the reality of apartheid South Africa. I'm not saying that no cases involving black South Africans were investigated at that time, because they obviously were, and good work was done on cases involving victims of all races. But there were significant failings, and greater attention was paid to white victims. We would be blind if we didn't acknowledge that. The other question is whether the family of Meadowbrook Doe would have reported her missing at all. At that time, it was not uncommon for people to leave their families and travel large distances to look for work, As I've seen in many serial murder cases, this played into the hands of offenders, because families often wouldn't know for months or years that something was wrong. By then, it might be too late to even know where to look. It's important for us to understand why South African authorities would send these bones overseas for testing. According to its website, the International Commission on Missing Persons, ICMP, works with governments, civil society organizations, justice institutions, and others throughout the world to address the issue of people who have gone missing because of armed conflict, human rights abuses, disasters, organized crime, irregular migration, and other causes. One of the ICMP's most important tools is advanced DNA extraction and testing, which is expensive and not widely available to law enforcement in most countries. When remains have been lying in soil for 23 years without protection from the elements, it is extremely difficult to extract DNA from them, and your best chance is an ICMP testing centre. So the remains of Meadowbrook Doe, or at least some of them, were probably sent to the testing centre in Bosnia, and it is there that the DNA profile was extracted. When I looked into the ICMP and read about its work with South Africa, I stumbled upon something that got me thinking. The National Prosecuting Authority has a Missing Persons Task Team. The unit was formed during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, to help identify victims of apartheid-era atrocities. By the time the TRC finished its work, 477 victims of events discussed at the Commission were still missing, so the task team was not disbanded. Instead, it continues to work to help identify victims and burial sites. It is led by Madeleine Fullard and works with forensic anthropologists and experts in related disciplines. The fact that there is no DNA match for Meadowbrook Doe in our standard victim identification system is no surprise. Finding out about the task team got me wondering, though. If any database had information about a black female who vanished in 1989 at the height of apartheid, it would probably be this one. Although families may not have come forward at the time, many have done so since the fall of apartheid and the work of the TRC. They provide information to the task team, which tries to match people with grave sites and remains. There's a good chance that Meadowbrook Doe's death had no political motivation, but her name and DNA profile might have made it onto the task team's database. When I initially covered this case, I contacted the NPA and the SAPS to see if the database had been checked, but received no reply. With all this information now collected, I started to look at exactly what we know about Meadowbrook Doe's case. We know that one day in 1989, a woman left home and never returned. Even that might be presumption, though, because it's been suggested that the victim may have been a live-in domestic worker, so she may have been killed while at home. Meadowbrook Doe could have come from any part of South Africa, or even from a neighbouring country. To determine how likely it could be that she was a foreigner, I did a bit of research into migration patterns. In the 1960s, 70s and early 80s, immigration into South Africa from neighbouring countries for the purposes of work wasn't easy. Legislation made it the employer's responsibility to ensure workers left the country when their contracts ended. During this time, migrants would have been mostly men coming to work in mining and agriculture. Between 1984 and 1994, the number of migrant workers in the country decreased significantly, so it seems likely that Meadowbrook Doe would have been a South African citizen. On that day in 1989, Meadowbrook Doe may have woken up on those premises. She may have arrived for work or she may never have been alive at that house. The only way we will figure out that part of the story is by identifying her. If we have Meadowbrook Doe's name, we could determine whether she was linked to the owners of the house in 1989. If she wasn't, she could be linked to a person who installed the pool. I believe those are the most likely options. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the best. I don't believe a random murderer happened to be driving past this house in 1989, saw a pool being built, and decided to use it to dispose of a victim. That would be too risky. In fact, even for someone living on the premises, it would have been risky, unless they were intimately familiar with the pool building process and knew exactly how and where to bury their victim, so she would be directly under the stairs. The pool stairs are usually installed last in the process, so the murder would have had to have taken place at exactly the right time to conveniently use them as the place of burial. I refer here to a murder because, to me, it seems clear that foul play was involved. Meadowbrook Doe did not crawl under that swimming pool foundation and die. I also firmly believe that the incisions on her dress are stab marks. If one of the pool builders was involved, it's unlikely to have been a labourer. It was probably someone with authority, someone who knew they could call the shots to avoid having their secret discovered as the pool was finished. That brings us back to Gert van Rooyen. It's important to clarify that there is no proof that Van Rooyen worked on this pool, but we know he did installation subcontracting work for Georgie Pools, the main contractor on this job, and that he installed pools in this general area. When I discovered that Meadowbrook Doe was an adult black female, I initially thought it all but ruled out Van Rooyen's involvement. His alleged victims were all apparently white schoolgirls. Except maybe they weren't. In recent new investigations, some sources have alleged that when Van Rooyen's home in Pretoria was searched after his death, cut-up school dresses were found. In 1989, our education system was still segregated, so black and white children did not attend the same schools or wear the same uniforms. According to the allegations recently made, the pieces of school uniforms found may have belonged to traditionally black schools. There are also reports of Van Rooyen getting into tussles in townships for harassing black women. Then there's his son, Flippy, who in 1991 was convicted of the rape, murder, and dismemberment of a black schoolgirl. So the Van Rooyen predators, accused and convicted, do seem to have crossed race lines where their victims were concerned. The only thing that bothers me about this is that the forensic anthropologist determined that Meadowbrook Doe was an adult. Charmaine Slater estimates that the green dress was probably a size 12. An older teenager may well wear a size 12 dress. David Klatzau, the forensic scientist hired by Rudy Marks, said it could not be discounted that the bones belonged to an older teenager. He also said that from looking at the photographs of the bones, he believed he could identify marks which could be consistent with the use of a saw. He doesn't think the marks could have been caused by the contractor's digging. The main reason someone would take a saw to the body is to dismember it. Flippy Van Rooyen's victim was dismembered, and dismemberment is not a terribly common practice among murderers. One thing we don't know for sure is whether all of Meadowbrook Doe's bones were found that day. If they weren't, it could mean her body was dismembered and placed in different disposal sites. Even if all the bones were found under the pool, dismemberment would have made it much easier for someone to sneak a body onto the site. There is one problem with the dismemberment theory, though. If Doe was dismembered, She wasn't wearing any clothing when it happened. Her dress is in one piece, and so are her tights. If you've gone to the trouble of dismembering a body, why bury the clothing in the same place as some of the body parts? Before I move on from the Van Rooyen theory, I must mention one more piece of information that I stumbled upon. In 2007, through an investigation led by the television program Carte Blanche, the house next door to Gert Van Rooyen's home was identified as a possible burial place of the 6 missing girls. The skeletonized remains of several people appear to have been found. Some were male, others female. All of them were found under the swimming pool. Even though all of this seems damning, it's really only circumstantial and possibly coincidental. There are some aspects of this crime that fit Van Rooyen or his son, but many more that don't. One thing that has always bothered me about these 6 missing girls Van Rooyen is believed to have abducted is that the cases may not have been solved because the focus has always been on Van Rooyen. This is not to say he didn't commit the crimes he and Joey Hardhoff are suspected of, but we have focused on these 2 people for more than 30 years, and it's led nowhere. So perhaps the answer lies in looking at the individual crimes and going where the evidence leads us, without preconceptions. I would hate it if Meadowbrook Doe's case went the same way as those of the 6 missing girls, just because Van Rooyen has been mentioned. The main reason it's almost impossible to solve a murder when the victim's identity is unknown is because most crimes are solved through understanding the victim. If we don't know who the victim is, who was close to them, and what might have been happening in their lives, it's difficult to work out where to start. So what else do we know about Meadowbrook Doe and her last moments on Earth? Because we don't have records from the company that built the pool, we don't know exactly when in 1989 it was put in. Meadowbrook Doe's dress is described by Charmaine Slater as being woolen, but in the photographs, it's not particularly thick material, bearing in mind that it had been buried for 23 years when it was discovered. The tights that were with the body don't appear to be normal pantyhose. They are black and seem quite thick. They remind me of the thick black stockings we used to wear at school in winter. So, I think it would be fair to assume that Meadowbrook Doe was not dressed for a hot summer's day. I don't think it was deep winter, but there was probably a chill in the air. Considering Gauteng weather patterns, that probably puts us either between April and June or early September. She could have had a jacket over her dress, which would point to the winter months. But I'm looking at this from the perspective of a person who is privileged enough to have a choice about what to wear according to the seasons. We don't know Meadowbrook Doe's economic situation, and it's possible that she didn't own many clothes and may have been forced to dress unsuitably for the season. There was one other thing that Charmaine Slater remembers being found that day, and that was a ring. There isn't a particularly good picture of it in the public domain, but it appears to be a plain brass-coloured band. It could most certainly be a wedding ring. If Meadowbrook Doe was a mother with relatively young children at the time of her death, they would be in their 40s now. Depending on her age, her parents may already be deceased. But people don't just disappear without at least one person remembering them. Someone knows that their mother, sister, daughter, wife or friend left home and never came back. Someone may have a recollection of the dress, somewhere in the dark reaches of their memory. Someone may remember their loved one having worked in this area before she disappeared. Those are the people who need to be reached. If a family member is found who can identify this clothing or the last known location of Meadowbrook Doe, their DNA can be compared to her profile. This episode was the first time I asked the True Crime South Africa community to engage with evidence and provide their opinions and insights. There's always a discourse when I cover unsolved cases, and everyone has an opinion about what happened. But Meadowbrook Doe provided the first opportunity for us to do this without having to be too careful. The podcast community engaged heavily, and soon everyone was sharing their memories of life in 1989, the types of clothing women wore, and even trying to figure out if the clothing items could be traced back to a particular place. One of the most incredible outcomes of this episode was that Kim and Rudy Marks, still the owners of the Meadowbrook house, reached out to me. Kim said that they had been deeply touched by the events of the day Doe was found on their property, and they were pleased to hear her story on the podcast. Over the years, the Marks family have never been able to forget Doe, and they remain committed to doing anything in their power to help resolve her case. At the time of Doe's discovery, they weren't living in the house. After buying it, they wanted to renovate before moving in. Perhaps this made a difference to how they experienced and processed the discovery of Doe's remains. Having a dead body found on your property is undoubtedly an uncomfortable situation. For many, it could change the way they see the home forever. Kim, though, says she feels it is now a peaceful and tranquil place, and she hopes that it has given Doe some peace, too. She often thinks of Doe, and in times of meditation, she's tried to connect with whatever essence of her remains there, hoping to discern her name. Something that stood out to me in this case is how we see skeletonized remains differently from recently deceased or slightly decomposed bodies. Layers of skin, tissue, sinew, and muscle seem to hold a sense of humanity. Once they are gone and only bare bones are left, most people find it easier to forget that the remains were once a human being. No one is really horrified by the sight of bones. On social media, pictures of recently deceased people are seldom shared, but when a skeleton is found, it seems to be fair game. I try to remind myself, though, that if a family member were to see those bones, they would feel very differently. Unfortunately, none of the avenues I tried when I released the episode have yielded any results. Knowing that we have a DNA profile for Doe, though, makes all the difference. It means we now have a far better chance of one day finding a match in a database. Vanessa Lynch of DNA for Africa, which supports the development of DNA databases and casework programs across the continent, recently put me in touch with an academic who is working on a new DNA identification database project. And that could lead to progress in this case. Each time I meet someone who works with DNA databases, I bring up Doe's story. One day, I'll meet the right person, and we'll find a way to give Doe back her name. I'm also painfully aware that Doe is only one of countless unidentified victims, many of which involve people who disappeared during the apartheid era. I'm heartened by a recent court ruling which allows apartheid atrocities to be prosecuted. While I don't think Doe's case is necessarily a political crime, the systemic inequities of that time and their continued effect cannot be ignored. Far too many families live with the mystery of a loved one who walked out the door one day and never came home. Meadowbrook Doe is representative of thousands of similar stories. Those people are waiting to have their names returned. For more victim-focused true crime content, please follow True Crime South Africa on the app you're using to listen right now. I also have another podcast you might like called I Lived Through This. Follow the podcast on social media platforms for updates on new episodes, my books, and events I attend across the country. If you'd like to support the podcast and grab some True Crime South Africa branded merch, head over to sacriminologist.co.za now. You can stock up on a wide range of true crime-themed merch, including tumblers, stickers, pens, mugs, and so much more. Use the code TCSA at checkout, and you'll get a site-wide discount of 10%. In case you don't know, I'm also a true crime author with 4 published books: Samurai Sword Murder, Sizzlers, Killer Stories, and Bare Bones, which is also published in Afrikaans as Klipkoot. All of your support for the podcast and the victims of crime in South Africa is greatly appreciated. I'll be back with another episode before you know it. Until then, thank you so much for your support, and I'll chat to you soon.